I've been a land surveyor for 12 years now, working mostly in the Appalachian region of Virginia and West Virginia. It's quiet work, lots of time alone in the woods with nothing but my equipment and the sounds of nature. I've always loved it. The solitude, the mountains, the feeling of being somewhere untouched by the modern world. But after what happened on Cutter Ridge, I've started to think that some places are untouched for a reason. It started with a routine job. A property developer had purchased a large tract of land on Cutter Ridge, about 200 acres of forest and meadow that had been in the same family for generations. The family, the Bledsoes, had finally agreed to sell after the last surviving member, an elderly woman named Alma, passed away. The developer wanted me to survey the property, mark the boundaries, and identify any issues that might complicate construction. Simple enough, right? I arrived on a gray morning in early November. The property was accessible by a single dirt road that wound up the side of the ridge, switching back on itself so many times that I lost count. By the time I reached the old Bledsoe homestead, a weathered farmhouse with a sagging porch and boarded-up windows, I felt like I'd driven back in time. The house was clearly abandoned, but it didn't look neglected. The grass around it had been recently cut, and there were fresh flowers in a coffee can on the porch steps. Someone was still taking care of the place, even though no one lived there anymore. I didn't think much of it at the time. Rural families often maintain properties long after they've been vacated. It's a way of honoring the past, keeping the memory of loved ones alive. I spent the first day working the southern boundary of the property, which ran along a creek bed and was relatively easy to survey. The terrain was rocky but manageable, and I made good progress. By late afternoon, I'd covered about half the distance I'd planned. That's when I found the cemetery. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd been given. There was no mention of it in the property records. But there it was, tucked into a hollow between two ridges, surrounded by a low stone wall that was crumbling in places. There were maybe 30 graves inside, most of them marked with simple field stones that had no names or dates. A few had proper headstones, granite markers with names I didn't recognize, and dates going back to the 1850s. All of them bore the name Bledsoe. I took photos and made notes, planning to include the cemetery in my report. Historic family cemeteries aren't uncommon in this region, and they're usually protected by law. The developer would need to know about it before he started any construction. I was photographing one of the older headstones when I heard a branch snap behind me. I turned around, expecting to see a deer, or maybe a curious neighbor. Instead, I saw a man. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. He wore work boots, canvas pants, and a heavy wool jacket that looked like it had seen decades of use. In his hands was a shotgun, pointed at the ground, but held in a way that suggested he knew how to use it. "You're on private property," he said. His voice was calm, almost friendly, but his eyes were not. "I know," I said, raising my hands slightly to show I wasn't a threat. "I'm a surveyor. I was hired by the developer who bought this land. I'm just here to mark the boundaries." The man's expression didn't change. "Nobody bought this land." "I'm afraid they did, sir, about 3 months ago. I have the paperwork in my truck if you'd like to see it." The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. "The land ain't for sale," he said. "Never was, never will be." I didn't know what to say to that. The transaction had been legal and documented. I'd seen the signed contracts, the deed transfer, the payment receipts, but something about the way this man spoke made me think he genuinely believed what he was saying. "I don't want any trouble," I said. "I'm just doing my job, but I do need to report the cemetery. It's not on any of the maps, and the developer needs to know about it before. You need to leave, the man interrupted. His grip on the shotgun tightened. Right now, and you need to forget you ever saw this place. I left. I wasn't about to argue with a man holding a shotgun, no matter how calm he seemed. But as I hiked back to my truck, I couldn't stop thinking about the cemetery, about the graves with no names, about the way the man had said, never was, never will be, with such absolute certainty. That night, I did some research. I looked up the Bledsoe family history, the property records, anything I could find about Cutter Ridge. What I discovered made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The Bledsoe family had lived on Cutter Ridge since the 1820s. They'd been farmers, moonshiners, and coal miners over the generations, and they'd kept mostly to themselves. The last official census record showed only 3 living Bledsoes: Alma, the elderly woman who had recently passed, and her 2 sons, Thomas and Gerald. But here's the thing. Thomas had died in 1987. Gerald had died in 1994. Alma had been the only living Bledsoe for nearly 30 years before her death. So who was the man with the shotgun? I called the developer the next morning and explained what I'd found: the unmarked cemetery, the confrontation with the armed man, the discrepancies in the family records. He was annoyed, but not surprised. Squatters, he said dismissively. Happens all the time with these old properties. I'll send someone to clear them out. You just focus on finishing the survey. I should have refused. I should have walked away from the job right then and there. But I needed the money, and I told myself that the developer would handle the situation. It wasn't my problem. I went back to Cutter Ridge the next day. This time, I stayed away from the cemetery. I worked the northern boundary, which ran along a rocky ridgeline with views of the valley below. It was beautiful country, and for a few hours, I almost forgot about the strange encounter. Then I found the second cemetery. This one was smaller than the first, maybe a dozen graves, all of them unmarked. But unlike the first cemetery, this one wasn't old. The stones were rough cut, but relatively new, and the ground around several of the graves showed signs of recent disturbance. I knelt down to examine one of the graves more closely. The dirt was loose, like it had been filled in within the last few months. And there was something else, a smell, faint but unmistakable. I'd smelled death before. Working in these woods, you come across dead animals all the time. Deer that didn't survive the winter, raccoons killed by predators. But this smell was different. It was heavier, more human. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding. I didn't know what was buried in those graves, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, multiple footsteps. I turned around and found myself facing not one man, but 5. The man with the shotgun was there, along with 4 others, younger men, all of them armed, all of them watching me with expressions of cold hostility. "We warned you," the older man said. "We told you to leave and forget." "I'm just doing my job," I said, my voice shakier than I would have liked. "I don't want any trouble." "Trouble's already here," one of the younger men said. "You brought it with you when you came snooping around where you don't belong." I thought about running, but there was nowhere to go. They had me surrounded, and they knew these woods far better than I ever would. "What's in those graves?" I asked. I don't know why I asked it. Maybe I thought that understanding what was happening would somehow help me survive it. The older man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had accepted something terrible a long time ago. "Family," he said simply. "Same as the others. Same as it's always been." "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand. You just need to leave. And this time, you need to never come back. Tell your developer that this land is cursed." Tell him it's haunted. Tell him whatever you need to tell him to make him go away. But you do not come back here. Ever. He stepped closer to me, and I could see the years in his face. The hard years of someone who had lived their whole life on this mountain, keeping secrets that would die with him. The Bledsoes have been here for 200 years, he said. We've buried our dead in these hills since before the government knew this land existed. And some of those dead, they don't stay buried. They need tending. They need watching. That's what we do. That's what we've always done. You're saying... I couldn't finish the sentence. It was too insane. I'm saying that there are things on this mountain that you don't want to wake up. Things that your developer with his bulldozers and construction crews would definitely wake up. And if that happens, it won't just be our problem anymore. It'll be everyone's problem. I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. It sounded like the ravings of a madman, but the graves behind me, the fresh graves with the smell of death, those were real, and the 5 armed men in front of me were very real. Okay, I said slowly. Okay, I'll leave. I'll tell the developer that the survey can't be completed. I'll make something up. The older man studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded. You're smarter than you look, he said. Now go, and remember what I told you. This land don't belong to us. It belongs to them, and they don't take kindly to strangers. I left. I packed up my equipment, drove down that winding dirt road, and never looked back. I told the developer that the terrain was too unstable for construction, that the environmental surveys would take years to complete, that the project wasn't worth the investment. He was furious, threatened to sue me, but eventually he gave up and sold the land back to, well, someone. I don't know who. I don't want to know. But sometimes I think about what that man said, about the graves that need tending, about the dead that don't stay buried, about the things on that mountain that you don't want to wake up. And I wonder what would have happened if the developer had gone ahead with his plans, if he'd brought in his bulldozers and construction crews, if he dug up those graves and disturbed whatever was sleeping beneath them. I don't think any of us would have liked the answer. Some hollows got secrets. Some ridges got things that don't want to be found. And some families have been keeping watch for so long that they've forgotten there was ever another way to live. If you ever find yourself surveying land in Appalachia, do yourself a favor. Check the old maps. Ask about the cemeteries. And if someone tells you to leave and never come back, listen to them. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some places don't want visitors. And some graves, well, they're better left undisturbed. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tales from the Holler. You know the drill. Like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Got a story of your own from the mountains? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, stay out of the woods after dark. And if you hear something moving through the trees that don't quite sound like an animal, don't go looking.